Chapter 2. Names. 50 years before the events of Team Gold. Timothy Nebo was no stranger to paperwork. He found it cathartic to accomplish something that could be accomplished without physical assertion. His mind was where he found the most joy. The satisfaction of seeing his hope fulfilled made him very easy to please when it could be fulfilled on paper. This particular sheet was different. It would bring with it implications and responsibilities that would redefine who he was on a fundamental level. It reminded him of the first day he went to school. He went from being a child to being a student. His schedule, lifestyle, and purpose for being were altered by the agreement made for him to bear that title. The same was true during the draft. He swore an oath to be a servant of his country. His duties would involve regularly putting himself in situations where his life was at risk. So much could change about a person when it's put on a piece of paper. Taking it up in his hands, he looked over it again. Not out of any sense of familiarizing himself with the information, but almost as if testing the physical weight would somehow offset the pressure put on his mind. The effects of material gravity did not dissuade his anxieties. He placed the paper down and instead turned his eyes to a new source of comfort. Ashpenez had gone from a POW to a sort of base mascot, rather organically over the past few weeks. Didn't take long before his interrogation reports were discovered to be fraudulent, yet even that wasn't true. He was applying intermittent pressure at regular intervals in between sessions of isolation and sleep deprivation. What he didn't clarify is that those moments of pressure during interrogation were little more than the prodding of a stick that barely dimpled his skin. Likewise, those moments of isolation were simply whenever he left him alone or to look at photos in his office. The sleep deprivation bit amused him the most. Technically, any given moment he wasn't sleeping was self-enforced sleep deprivation. When it was discovered, his superiors ultimately decided it wasn't relevant anyway, since the child truthfully had no connections with any military threat to Atlas. What Captain Nebo decided to do with the faunus was his problem. As he played around the office, he smiled at his eagerness to learn about anything and everything he could. He asked the sort of questions that teachers would be honored to answer. He didn't just ask what color something was, but what colors were. His mind was a lot like his own. The fact that he saw a reflection of his own nature in a being he wouldn't have considered human 2 seasons ago lifted his heart as quickly as it broke it. Letting out a small breath, he called for the boy. "Ashpenez, could I ask you a question?" His attention turned from the small book aiding him in basic grammar and phonics that was purchased for him the day before. "What is it?" Ashpenez queried with his unique accent. Nebo made a conscious attempt to withhold any negative display of emotions and meet his eye level. "What does your name mean?" His eyes became downcast, but not out of an inability to answer. He embarrassingly put a finger to the bridge of his nose and began rolling his ankle behind him. The image he portrayed was cute, but Nebo thought that he was withholding the answer rather than giving one. "If you're not sure, I can—" Ashpenez shook his head. "No, it means this." He gestured to his nose again. "Horse nose." This surprised Nebo. As alien as faunus culture was to him, the name itself revealed what kind of faunus he was. The more dramatic traits demonstrated by Ashpenez's kin were usually seen through ears and tails. Yet in this case, you wouldn't have been able to distinguish him from a human apart from his advanced muscle structure. He was faster than most twice his age, he realized. Yet even in his school days, he recalled completely human classmates who similarly reflected biological affinity for athletic activities. He appreciated the thought that went into his name rather than what appealed to his parents on a superficial level. Yet even the most subtle of his peers would rarely consider giving his name that kind of thought. The potential for teasing caused him to crease his brow and consider another factor in this endeavor. "Do you like that name?" As shy as his explanation was, there was no hesitation in Ashpenez's response to preserve his identity. Content with this, Nebo smiled. "I agree. Names are important. To lose a name is to embrace a kind of death." Ashpenez considered the statement. "What's death?" Without hesitation, Nebo replied, "It means separation. It refers to a lot of things, and the consequences that follow." A wave of grief briefly passed over him as names, dates, and situations associated with the term came to mind. "But we're not talking about separation right now. We're going to talk about joining." Ashpenez started bouncing at the possibility of learning new words. "Tell me if you know what this word means." "Adoption." Ashpenez's face lighted up when the implication set in. "And there's another name I'm learning more about as well. Father." Current day. Olivia depended on the sunlight to irritate her eyes into waking up in the morning. Her physiology reacted to any change of temperature to reflect the level of activity her body could support. This morning was different. Her circadian rhythm got her up consistently at a reasonable hour, but this morning was different. The sunlight was negated by the rare storm clouds that had begun forming in the latter summer months. These are the times where she was at risk of getting sick or at minimum caught in the throes of lethargy. She then realized that with consciousness came memory. Daniel was there with her. His consistent body heat offset both a biological and emotional lack that she couldn't provide for herself. Fully able to rise, but at the same time content to remain where she was, the moment was enjoyed a few seconds longer before she decided to kiss him awake. Returning the gesture, Daniel began to shift and gather himself from the bed frame while considering its ability to handle his weight. Olivia began to stretch and realized that she normally depended on the sunlight to keep her energy up. Not waiting for permission, or needing it, she returned to embracing Daniel, and he continued unimpeded to his morning routine. A fond image recalled the day they met when she ambushed him in the desert. The start of their new life together was an anchor for her smile that even the storm clouds couldn't stand in the way of. As Daniel went from washing the sweat off of his face and making motions to apply soap to his extremities, Olivia simply hung from his shoulders and enjoyed the moment. "I need to get my uniform on now." Olivia pouted as she slid down from his back and faded into the backdrop of their room. Unmoved by her protest, he attached the superficial portions of his armor that were more for cosmetic rather than practical protection, and eventually spotted Olivia's silhouette of influence, making her jacket and pants seemingly levitate until coming into contact with her aura. Shaking his head and securing the last belt on his van braces, he got to his feet and stood facing the door. Olivia reappeared in the clothing she had acquired to compensate for the weather, realizing it was an invitation. She giggled and jumped back onto her new husband's back and let the heat settle back in. Quickly gathering her hair into a loose ponytail, she freed her hand to hold onto his shoulder guard that unfortunately was still cold from the night air. "Let's check on Havilah. I think the instructor left us something as well." As the storm's wind began to hit, her mood slowly adapted in kind. "Okay." Daniel recognized the tone as less than her bubbly self and more consciously communicated than what the weather would force upon her. A conscious disapproval was taking place of the plans he was making for the day. "Is something wrong?" Olivia rubbed her cheek on the back of his neck and tried to bring her temperature up. "I just want to spend the morning with you." He smiled at the compliment. "I understand. It's not the best day for it, but she's not in a good place right now." Nodding, she rested on his back and allowed him to lead the way. Daniel began to explain the things they likely had ahead for them and how to approach Havilah's comfort. Yet as the journey was made to the instructor's quarters, thoughts began to haunt her, and she realized just how much another woman was occupying her husband's thoughts. "We better hurry then. I can tell Havilah's well-being means the most to you right now." Daniel's pace faltered slightly, but he continued on his way. His mind struggled with processing exactly what he just heard. The implications flooded his mind in kind. Daniel grew quiet as they continued their way to their intended destination. Havilah noticed the shift in colors from a deep blue to a cold gray, illuminating the office. The couch was more than enough to accommodate her frame, but the comfort of sleep eluded her. She resigned herself to that fact and mentally prepared herself for when and where that fatigue would likely catch up with her. Frustrated with causes beyond her control, she forced herself to bring her hands to her face and allowed her ears to shift and flex out of any loss of circulation that took place from tossing and turning on the furthermost armrest as a pillow. Her tail hung limply as her semblance flooded her with energy, yet her mind remained in a state of sheer agony, not unlike the sensation of fear. She certainly wasn't afraid of anything in the room with her. The yawning gap between her ability and willingness to act upon even basic morning cosmetics simply left her in a state uncomfortable with her own skin. If fight or flight against an unseen foe could be described as panic, then a fearful reflex against an unassailable foe was desperation. She couldn't bring herself to do anything apart from sit on the couch that failed to provide her any adequate environment for sleep. Nothing in the room was unnerving, uncomfortable, or unfamiliar. It had all simply become meaningless. The hint of possibly living this way from now on threatened to overwhelm her in a chasm she couldn't escape from, and she may as well have been transported back to the days where she lived without walls. The only difference between her then and now was a willingness to run. If she were to run away, where would she go? Would she simply lie down like a wounded animal and let the grim pick her off as they pleased? Or would she just run until the runner's high reset her brain and adjusted to the grief in its own way? Pragmatism was her preference, but her emotions didn't just know when to stop. Before her thoughts turned to regrettable decisions, a knock came at the door. She quietly reprimanded herself before a mistake had even been made and moved to respond in kind. She was a mess, but she didn't care. Anyone who was unaware of the instructor's absence could piece together the image of a disheveled faunus as a hint. She opened the door and saw Olivia and Daniel attempting the most neutral expression she had ever seen from them. Her ears raised reflexively, which they took as a good sign. Wanting solace in her misery, she consciously pursued a mindset that brought them down again and made her way back to the couch. They took this as an invitation to begin to search for a light. Luminants were a handy development, but not the intensity that suited their friend's mood at the moment. She could tell it wasn't suiting theirs either. The last few days had been hell for all of them, and even in light of the one positive that could be acknowledged, she put it out of mind to remain where she was the most comfortable. "How are you doing?" Daniel queried. Havilah rolled her eyes, knowing full well they had all had the same source of grief. Instead of answering his question, she began another conversation entirely. "The instructor left these for you. We also need to update our team roster for the database." A certificate of death stood out most prominently on the pile of papers that awaited their attention. Daniel leaned forward and brushed it aside as he examined the others. Taking a moment to regard Gideon's name on each of them, he took a quiet breath for the sake of not upsetting the girls that were with him. Olivia made her way to Havilah and made her way to embrace her. They both seemed distracted, but admired how reflexively they pursued and accepted physical comfort. Whether it was a girl thing or a faunus thing, he wasn't in either category, so he'd never know. The marriage certificate stood out the most to Daniel and reached for a quill to begin with the easiest to acknowledge. "Daniel Temple," he spoke aloud as he wrote. "Born September 30th. Relatives, Great War refugee." Passing the paper over to Olivia, who reached over Havilah's head, repeated the gesture. "Olivia Hananiah, born December 30th. Relatives, Great War refugee." Moving the paper aside after signing it, he reached for Gideon's death certificate. Not reading this one aloud, he reflected a moment on his name. Havilah spoke his thoughts aloud. "His last name was Azariah, from the same language root as ours. It means helper." She gestured to the lexicon she retrieved from the bookshelf that still hadn't been inspected and cleared of historical or religious literature after Beacon ordered them to be recalled. Olivia gave a quiet smile. "What's your name mean?" Havilah brushed off the question. "Yours means gracious. Daniel means judge." He looked up from the document and raised an eyebrow. "That's not all it means." She brought her knees to her chest, and Olivia returned to consoling her. They both pursed their lips and continued on. "What are these?" Daniel gestured to empty birth certificates.
"The government is getting more organized, and the orphans of the Great War are getting put into a database that Dr. Nebo has set up,"
Havaliah repeated, imitating the heavy accent the instructor explained it to her in. Daniel and Olivia both stifled a laugh, and Havaliah appreciated it was well received. The mood had become lighter, and she became more comfortable with it as a burden lifted off her shoulders.
"His first name was my favorite. Hewer, or Feller of Monsters."
She wouldn't speak it, but they all recalled his specialty of taking down the biggest and baddest of monsters. The memory felt warm. Olivia relished in it, and Havaliah felt room to breathe for a moment. Daniel smiled and considered what more should be said. "They're suiting. Our names, I mean." Havaliah shook her head.
"I don't think so anymore. We'll never be the same after this."
Daniel followed her eyes to their team roster half hidden under his arm.
"That's old now."
It took him a moment to realize she was speaking seriously. That literally was their team name as it stood. It was too soon to seek out a replacement. It was too soon to even acknowledge who the G stood for. He had the luxury of recent distractions not to consider exactly what he saw, but he had seen enough Grimm die to know it was different from human beings after death. Gideon was a lot of things, but a Grimm wasn't one of them. His power was unique, but no more than his own semblance utilized to its potential. There were too many questions, and he wasn't sure he would like the answers. A small groan was emitted as Daniel sat down. "All we know for now is that we're still here." Both of the girls watched him as he gathered his breath in what they assumed was out of processing emotions his own way. Havaliah especially noted the waste bin containing ashes from a prior letter that had apparently needed disposal of. Olivia sensed her anxiety and continued to brush her hair in an attempt to distract her. They were all tired and burdened by something they didn't seem capable of handling. After a moment passed from processing the silence, Havaliah reached out to a blank birth certificate and gestured for the quill. She quietly wrote out her name and handed it back to Daniel. Looking at what he was given, he read the name aloud. "Leia?" Olivia looked taken aback, and Havaliah's eyes darkened in a way that reflected the fatigue they all felt. "You couldn't pronounce my old name anyway. I think this one fits where we are now." She gestured at the lexicon and made to leave the room, leaving her hair down and putting a jacket over her workout clothes that remained on her person since they had returned from their last combat mission.
"I'm going for a run."
Olivia began to protest, but the door had already closed before a word could be spoken. With her open hand, she instead moved to take the lexicon and began looking through its pages. Daniel watched as she seemingly discovered what she was looking for and began to tear up. She quickly got up to chase after her and left the book behind to the page she had discovered. Daniel noted the page and saw the term Leia 3/4 of the way down. "Burden," it read. Groaning within himself, Daniel quickly took up the quill and consigned to filling out the forms before anything else would be done. He still felt out of breath and moved to loosen his shin guards. The last thing he wanted to do was chase after somebody. He filled out the names and redacted the others to update it all before he noticed it was beginning to rain. His thoughts immediately went to Olivia as he gathered up the pages. With a strain of effort, he made to find them both and hopefully not catch a cold in the process. As he made his way outside, his thoughts went back to the words, or lack thereof, exchanged between him and Olivia before reaching the instructor's office. An alarm cut off the thought reflexively, reminding him to retrieve his armor and weapons. Training occupied his thoughts for now, and would hopefully do the same for the girls. This was a grim incursion. Grief could wait. They had a job to do.